let's be honest. These are challenging times. You know, sometimes it feels like everything we grew up believing has vanished into thin air. And the American dream? Well, that seems about as realistic as a 1950s sitcom. So what do we do when, as a society and as individuals, we need to reinvent ourselves, find new paradigms, new ideas, new ways of being in order just to survive? About 7 years ago, I experienced what I've come to call the perfect financial storm. I lost my home, my life savings, most of my material possessions, and I ended up in massive debt. In other words, about 3 years before the rest of the country and the world had their economic meltdowns, I had mine. So what did I do about it? Am I some miraculous success story who has radically transformed her life? Not yet. But I am a very hopeful work in progress. And I attribute my turnaround to one very simple question. But before I get to that, I should confess that the first thing I did as things fell apart was try to pretend it wasn't happening. When I was a kid, my dad told me that he was a college freshman when the stock market crashed in 1929, and some of his schoolmates' fathers were among the men who jumped to their deaths from the buildings high above Wall Street. Back then, I couldn't fathom why money would want to make anyone take their own life. But as an adult, I got it. I was flooded with fear and terror, guilt and shame. And all of it was made worse by the fact that I was somewhat of a public figure, a prominent businesswoman in a small town, and the daughter of a celebrity. My dad was the actor, Vincent Price. But it was about this time that I began hearing my mother's voice. Now, I need you to understand how ironic this was, because although my mother had already passed away, when things fell apart, it was her judgment I constantly imagined saying, "How could you have let this happen?" And I beat myself up with that mercilessly. But this time, her voice held no rancor. She simply asked, "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" I recognized the question as coming from one of her favorite Bible stories about a woman whose husband had died, leaving her so deeply in debt that she felt her only option was to sell her 2 sons into slavery and then kill herself. Now, fortunately, a prophet came along, and after hearing about her story, he asked her, "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" She said she only had a little bit of oil, but he told her to go out and borrow every vessel she could from all of her neighbors, come home and fill those vessels with that oil. And miraculously, that oil filled every vessel. She was able to sell it and pay off all her debt. So after my parents were divorced, whenever my mother had a financial problem, she asked herself that question. And her answers ranged from overlooked possessions that she could sell to resources among her friends and in her community. It was a reminder to her that usually she already had what she needed to solve her problems. So when I heard her voice asking me that question, the first thing that popped into my mind was this storage unit that I had full of boxes of my parents' things that, frankly, I'd been trying to ignore. Now, this wasn't important stuff that had all been sold or donated years before. This was just stuff I needed to sort through before throwing the rest out. But in the first box I opened, I pulled up this beat-up old leather wallet that had belonged to my dad in the 1970s with the name Vincent rather crudely embossed on it. eBay, I thought. Try eBay. I did. It worked. And suddenly my unwanted possessions were bailing me out of my most immediate needs. But that didn't solve all my problems, not by a long shot. I still had a business that was teetering on failure. As persistent in death as she was in life, my mother kept asking, "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And sure enough, solutions began to present themselves. When my company designer decided to move on with his career, the thought came, you could do this yourself. Now, what you need to understand here is that my mother had been a very successful costume and architectural designer, and I had apprenticed with her, working on many of her projects. But even then, I knew that the last thing I wanted to do was follow in my mother's footsteps. She was the strict parent, the disciplinarian, and I wanted to study theater and art history like my joyful and life-affirming dad. But suddenly, those skills I had learned from my mother were a resource. And within 3 weeks of hanging out my shingle as a designer, I had 13 clients, and that saved my business. By then, asking myself what I had in the house had become a kind of daily mantra. And soon it seemed like every time I needed an answer, one came. And then the economy tanked. But this time I wasn't blindsided. Although my business took a huge hit, like everyone else's, I knew I had tools. I went back to that Bible story and I thought, the first thing that woman did was she took inventory, which is what I'd been doing, and I discovered some amazing assets, but I had overlooked at least one serious liability, which was the way I had internalized my parents' massive fears about money. So I realized I actually had some serious house cleaning to do. My daily mantra brought me inspiration from so many sources, but the one that probably has meant the most to me is a story about the Navajo, who, when they were forced from their homeland by the US government in the 1860s and onto the Long Walk and then incarcerated at Bosque Redondo for 4 years, they lost everything. Now, for the weavers, this meant their sheep and their livelihood. But they couldn't stop weaving. And so they took the blankets that the US government issued them, they unraveled them, and they rewove them into some of the most beautiful textiles ever woven, and they changed the whole course of Navajo weaving. In a bad economy, it's easy to think, if only I lived someplace else, or I had a better job, or I had the money to be able to go back to school, things would be better. But the Navajo didn't have that choice. And so, in perhaps one of the most beautiful of lemon into lemonade stories, I recognized the blessing of having no way out. Looking inside ourselves takes courage, no matter who we are. But sometimes we have no other choice. Like the Navajo, we can't turn back. Our old ways of living have vanished, and all we have is who we are and what we've learned and how we've chosen to live. But here's the beauty part. That will always be more than enough if we can have the courage and the humility to turn off the autopilots of our lives and look long and hard at the stories we've been playing out and the skills we've forgotten we had, the resources that surround us, and even the baggage that we need to discard. Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. Easy for you to say. You had a famous father and a successful mother. You even had a storage unit full of stuff you could sell. What do I have? But every single time I ask myself what I have in the house, my first thought is nothing. If you had told me 7 years ago that I would be standing up here talking about something that was so shameful and terrifying to me, let alone talking about it from a place of joy and gratitude, I would have said you were crazy. But I am standing here because I've proved to myself that, cliched as it may sound, every crisis can become an opportunity to reinvent ourselves using who we already are from the inside out. Which is why I am sharing my mother's story and my father's joy in beginning a dialogue with my community that I truly believe can help us all. And so I hope that you will tell me what you have in your house. Thank you.